Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here with us for today's online event on preparing Singapore for climate change, partnered with the Singapore-ETH Centre and the Earth Observatory of Singapore. My name is Alethea from the National Supercomputing Centre, Singapore, or NSCC for short. For those of you who are not familiar with us, NSCC is a national research infrastructure funded by the National Research Foundation of Singapore. NSCC is home to Singapore's first national petascale supercomputer, the Aspire-1. We provide high-performance computing, or HPC in short, resources to researchers from all local research institutes, institutes of higher learning, government agencies, as well as all companies in both the public and private sector. Commissioned in 2016, Aspire-1 is one of the few high-rise supercomputers in operation and has a number of unique power-saving features, from air cooling heat transfer from the floor above to warm water cooling technology that reduces power needed for cooling conventional data centers. Its intelligent data center monitoring has helped improve the power usage effectiveness from 1.36 to 1.08. To support the growing HPC needs of Singapore's research community, Singapore's newest national supercomputer, the Aspire-2A, will be coming your way in the first quarter of 2022. With a focus on better energy efficiency and lowering carbon emissions, the new system is designed for sustainability and has been awarded the Singapore Building and Construction Authority Green Mark Platinum Award. Housed at the NUS Innovation 4.0 building, the new system is expected to use less power via a number of unique features. These include a purpose-designed air-condition-free environment in its compute chamber, a unique warm water cooling system designed for the tropics, as well as inbuilt digital monitoring with IoT sensors and intelligent monitoring and AI-assisted operations. So look out for this coming your way soon. Additionally, NSCC has been working with partners to explore novel green data center concepts and architectures in our bid to lower carbon emissions for our compute resources. For example, we have recently collaborated with SLNG Corp, Sabana Jurong, and the National University of Singapore to conceptualize the development of a green modular data center system, which could well be the first of its kind in Singapore. NSCC is also exploring other green data center alternatives through our network of overseas HPC center partners. Potential options to reduce our carbon footprint includes leveraging the climate in colder regions to take advantage of ambient cooling, and tapping on the availability and abundance of renewable energy resources in partner countries. If you are interested, do find out more about projects and our HPC resources at www.nscc.sg. So without further ado, let's get on with the main aspect of this webinar. Our Earth's climate is changing. Heat waves are likely to be more frequent and longer lasting. Extreme rainfall will become more intense and frequent, and the global sea level will rise. It is projected that Singapore is likely to become warmer, experience more frequent and heavier storms, and face rising sea levels. Our two speakers for today will touch on how HPC-enabled research, technologies, and innovations could help prepare Singapore for climate change and preserve our environment for future generations. Starting off the presentations will be Dr. Heiko Aydt from the Singapore-ETH Centre. Dr. Aydt is a computational scientist with expertise in modeling and simulation, as well as computer science with a focus on software engineering of distributed systems. He currently leads the research and development of the digital urban climate twin for Singapore to support urban planners and policymakers in their efforts to address the urban heat challenge. Next will be Professor Benjamin Horton, who is the Director of the Earth Observatory of Singapore at the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. His research concerns sea level change, and he aims to understand the mechanisms that have determined sea level changes in the past, which will shape changes in the future. Before we get started with the talk, please note that if you have any questions, do post them in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. We will address your questions during our live Q&A and panel discussion segment, which will be moderated by Professor Jeff Obat, Head of Climate Science Research Office at the Centre for Climate Research Singapore at Meteorological Service Singapore. So stay tuned right to the end to the panel discussion segment. So without further ado, let me warmly welcome Dr. Heiko Aydt to get us started. Dr. Aydt, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Heiko Aydt. I'm the lead investigator for Digital Urban Climate Twin Research and Development at the Singapore-ETH Center. The work that I'm going to talk about is part of the Cooling Singapore project, and the title of my talk is Supercomputing for Climate-Informed Urban Planning. Let me first say a few words about the urban heat challenge. The first part is we have global climate change. We already know that temperatures are increasing, and that, of course, is also affecting cities. Cities are getting warmer because of that. In Singapore, just like any other city, we have also regional effects of the global climate change. And in Southeast Asia, what we can observe is more extreme weather events along the lines of heat waves, as well as heavy rainfall. These we can already observe today, and there will be more of those in the future. We are also suffering from the urban heat island effect. The urban heat island effect, to put it in simple terms, is the temperature difference between the temperature inside the city and outside in the rural hinterlands. Basically, what it means is in cities, the temperatures can be warmer than outside, and quite significantly, as we will see shortly. There's two kinds of contributors to it. The first, we call the passive contributors. That's basically the land change that we cause by building cities, building roads, building buildings, the lack of vegetation and the lack of natural ventilation is all contributing to the passive contributors, or the passively contributing to the urban heat island effect. We also have active contributors, and by that we mean the heat that we are emitting actively inside the city, whether it be through industrial processes, building air conditioning, transport, and other processes that are going on in the city that are emitting waste heat. Now, in Singapore, the urban heat island intensity can be as high as 7 degrees Celsius. That is a temperature difference that has been measured by some of my colleagues some years ago. And it basically means that in the evenings, when we have the peak of the urban heat island effect, we can measure 7 degrees Celsius between the temperature in the city compared to some place outside in a natural area. And that's quite significant. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about now is digital urban climate twin. What exactly is that and what can we do with it? Let me first start off by talking about a digital urban twin. So what's a digital urban twin? If you ask 5 people about how they would define a digital urban twin, you probably get 5 different definitions. Here's mine. To me, a digital urban twin is a composition of specialized computational models, each representing an urban element of interest, such as buildings, traffic, air conditioning, microclimate. But very importantly, a digital urban twin to me is not only geometry and textures for the purpose of visualization, but also dynamic behavior for the purpose of simulating cause and effect. And that's very important because if you can simulate cause and effect, you can use this digital urban twin to conduct what-if analysis and perform experiments with the city in silico that would otherwise not be possible in the real world. Okay, so that was the definition of a digital urban twin. Now, what is a digital urban climate twin? A digital urban climate twin here is really a digital urban twin that is specifically built to study the urban climate of a particular city of interest. In our case, that's Singapore. And the insights gained from the experimentation, the what-if analysis in particular, can be used to support research as well as urban planning and climate-informed policy. Okay, so I've basically very briefly explained what the digital urban climate twin is about. And I've already mentioned a lot of supercomputing. I mentioned a lot of models that we need. And there's, of course, also a need for supercomputing for that. Why is that? Now, if planners and decision makers want to use a digital urban climate twin to better understand the potential impact of their decisions before they're being implemented, they can use the digital urban climate twin as a tool to make these what-if analysis, run the what-if scenarios, and better understand the impact of these things, of their actions. And then you get a loop, because basically what you can do is you can come up with a new scenario, simulate it, analyze it, you modify perhaps a few things, and then you repeat the simulation process. And by doing so, you can come up with better decisions or better actions, better plans for implementing mitigation measures. But it also involves running quite a number of simulations. I mentioned a number of models, specific computational models earlier on. And I want to highlight another key component of the digital urban climate twin, and that's the federation of models. That's basically the heart piece of the digital urban climate twin, because this is where all the different models are. In general, the digital urban climate twin consists primarily of two types of models. The first one, or the first category, is the urban climate models. At the end of the day, we're interested in climatic data and climatic output. What's going to happen to the urban climate? And these we get from the urban climate models, whether this be on a mesoscale, on a micro scale, doesn't matter. It's basically urban climate models. We also want to know how anthropogenic heat emissions contribute to the urban heat island. I mentioned that earlier. So we have a number of anthropogenic heat emission models, whether this be for industry, for power plants, or traffic, or anything else for that matter. By the way, the configuration that you see on the right hand of the screen is only an example. You don't necessarily need all these models for your what-if scenarios, and there could be other models that you want to plug in into the future. But basically, the idea is that a single what-if scenario involves a number of models. And again, the configuration of the models depends on the use case, on the scenario. And depending on the scenario, you may have to conduct not one, but many simulation runs, each using a different set of parameters, for instance. So basically, if you just want to evaluate a couple of scenarios, and each of them has a number of simulation runs, you end up with a total number of simulation runs that can be quite compute intensive. To make things worse, yes, we can use supercomputing, but there are limits to scalability. So the bad thing is that the speed up that we can achieve for a single simulation run is limited. And that has something to do with a very technical aspect of parallel computing. Basically, the more parallel processors or the more parallel computing you do, the more processors you're using for your simulation, the more communication overhead you get. It's parallel computing, but all these different parallel processes that are running, they have to communicate with each other. And that's causing a communication overhead, which at some point will be so significant that even if you throw a lot more computing resources at it, the simulation isn't going to run any faster. The ugly part also is that all this is costing not only a lot of computing resources, but of course also a lot of energy. So you want to be really mindful of how much parallelization you're actually doing, because it may very well not give you a lot of performance increase, but at the same time, you're increasing your energy consumption a lot. This is something that we want to avoid. It's also cost. The good thing is you don't actually need to worry so much about improving the performance of a single simulation run, because as I mentioned earlier, you have many simulation runs and they can run perfectly alongside each other. There's no simulation, there's no communication overhead between the different simulation runs. So what you can actually do is, instead of running one simulation with a lot of computing resources, you can run a lot of simulation scenarios, each with a modest amount of computing resources, and thereby avoiding this issue with the limits of scalability. So that's a good thing. I won't talk more about the supercomputing effect or the supercomputing aspects of it, but just to say that there's quite a lot of things involved that have to be worked out in order to make this happen. What I want to talk now is how to bridge the gap, because I mentioned earlier that it's all about policy and urban planning, but then we're also talking about supercomputing, and I think everyone can probably see there's quite a large gap. Now, how do we address this? First, our approach is to use a simulation as a service middleware. That's a very technical thing, but let me just get at a few key points for it. The approach that we're having is that we want to be able to run simulations as easily as interacting with a web service. User provide the input, trigger some simulation, and collect the output when the job is done. That's it. We don't want the user to have to worry about the technical aspects about the supercomputing, the model setup, and all the nitty-gritty details of actually running it. Now, in order to make this happen, we use a middleware. And the middleware is basically, there's this definition of Wikipedia, but really what I really like about it is basically the software glue. I think that really is a good explanation of what a middleware is. It's basically the glue that puts all these different models together that I mentioned earlier as part of the Federation of Models. So building a digital urban climate twin requires putting together a variety of computational models. And this is really what the middleware is doing. The other thing is that simulating a what-if scenario using the digital urban climate twin doesn't require only one model. I've mentioned that a couple of times. It requires multiple models as part of a potentially fairly complex workflow. And I'll just give you one example here. That's actually a workflow that we use to simulate the urban heat island effect. There's a number of steps involved, simulating the city as it is with all its urban development, and then having a hypothetical scenario where we just say, let's remove the city in this scenario entirely, which means that without the city, there is no urban heat island effect at all. We simulate both, and then we calculate the difference, and that gives us the urban heat island effect. That's only one way of calculating it. But I use this as an example to show what a workflow might look like. So at the moment, all these things have to be done manually, and that's time consuming and also error prone. What the digital urban climate twin will be able to do with the help of this simulation as a service middleware is automating these workflows. So apart from the technical aspects, really, if you want to, just in very simple terms, what does this SaaS middleware do? It basically takes care of the technical complexities of putting things together so the user can focus on the what-if analysis rather than on how to get stuff to work part. So that's already, I think, taking care of a lot of the issues that users would face with all this modeling and supercomputing stuff. The second part is that we are working on applications, digital urban climate twin applications. And they will be web-based and they will be very graphical. And these DACT applications will be tailored to the needs of the end users. These include urban planners, designers, decision makers, the Singapore government agencies, but also in the research community. Cooling Singapore is using it for conducting what-if scenarios, and there can be users even beyond that. So the idea here is that with these applications, we would make it much, much easier and lower the burden or the obstacles for using the digital urban climate twin. Okay, now how do we get from supercomputing to policy? I mentioned earlier that we have the SaaS middleware, and that's basically the infrastructure level. It takes care of all the supercomputing stuff and all the models, how to put them together, how to make them interact with each other, how to convert data from one format to another, moving the data around from the supercomputer to a cloud instance, which may also be part of the Federation of Models. You may also have some computers running inside your organization in the intranet. So the middleware is basically responsible for connecting all these and making it seamlessly happen. That's our first major contribution to this problem. The second is the computation, the DACT Federation of Models. That's basically where all the magic is happening of the digital urban climate twin. This is where the models are. This is where the workflows are happening. I mentioned earlier that depending on the what-if scenario, you choose a different configuration of models and different workflows. So all this is happening on the computation layer. And of course, it's closely related to the middleware. The middleware makes all this happen. Then there are the applications. So as soon as we have basically the middleware, which is taking care of the computational part of it, making all these models work together. We have the Federation of Models, which is basically all the individual models that we need. And then we have the DACT application sitting on top of that, that makes it possible for the users to use these models, to execute these workflows, to ask these what-if questions, and to study the results in a graphical user environment with a graphical user interface. That makes it a lot easier to see what's going on. Once the user is able to do that, the user can also then start defining different what-if scenarios. You define a scenario, you simulate it, you analyze it, and you keep doing this until you're happy with the outcome. And then, of course, once you're able to do that, this is when you can start working on the policy. And by that, I mean master plans and roadmaps. Once you have the ability to explore different what-if scenarios, also potentially perform optimization, you could build a decision support on top of that. That's when you can start thinking about master plans and roadmaps. So yeah, that's basically how we envision to bridge this gap between the supercomputing that happens all the way on the bottom with the SaaS middleware and the policy, which ultimately is about master plans and roadmaps. And as I mentioned earlier, the major contributions that the Cooling Singapore project is doing here is, of course, the SaaS middleware and the federation of models, but we are also working on duct applications. We also already use the digital urban climate twin to conduct our own what-if scenarios. And with that, we hope that the agencies will have the necessary tools at their hand to then do the policy aspect of it, master planning and road mapping. All right, just a few words about future work. We have a roadmap as well, development roadmap. And in particular, from now, roughly now until February 22, we are planning to have our first testnet, as we call it the alpha testnet. It will be for internal users. And once we've got that done, we will start a beta testnet. The beta testnet is going to be for internal and also external users. So this is where things are going to be pretty interesting, because this is when we will really be making this available to some of our colleagues outside of the Cooling Singapore project. The Cooling Singapore project, in particular, the Digital Urban Climate Twin, is not just an academic exercise. So the ultimate goal is really to deploy this Digital Urban Climate Twin in Singapore, make it operational, and make it available to the government agencies and other organizations that might be interested in it. So starting next year, we will also think about how to roll this out. We're also planning to set up a website. And the website is not only going to be sort of the entry point where you can find the applications, but there will also be information about the Digital Urban Climate Twin. So stay tuned. We will probably create this website, started sometime early next year. And I want to close this talk by saying that the urban heat island is not just a problem for Singapore. There's many cities around the world that suffer from the urban heat island effect. And as I've explained earlier, it's not just the urban heat island effect, there's also the issues with global climate change. So cities have to deal with the urban heat challenge. And we believe that a tool like the Digital Urban Climate Twin can help cities to do that. And our declared vision would be that really we are starting in Singapore with the Digital Urban Climate Twin, but then we hope to find users all over the world for the Digital Urban Climate Twin. We will need different models, of course. The one that we're building at the moment, the Digital Urban Climate Twin that we're building at the moment, is for Singapore. You can't reuse the same models, of course, in other cities, but you can use the same framework, you can use the same applications. And yes, so we hope to find more users in the future. And we hope to make a useful contribution, a significant contribution to addressing the urban heat challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aydt, for introducing us to your very impressive digital twin project. I'm sure a lot of the viewers would have many questions to ask, and as well as to ask on how they can tap on its resources. So next up, we have Professor Benjamin Horton from the Earth Observatory of Singapore, who will be talking about the sea level changes and what it means for Singapore. Professor Horton, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to give a brief presentation about the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 6th assessment report. I'm going to talk about Chapter 9, which concerned the sea level changes of the 21st century. The IPCC report, the 6th assessment report, was a colossal task. It involved over 230 authors from 65 countries. Importantly, for the sixth assessment report, there were over 30% new to the IPCC process. It was a colossal task because this author team had to review over 14,000 peer-reviewed scientific publications to provide their perspective on the state of the climate. The author teams had to respond to a colossal 78,000 review comments. They came from other members of the scientific community, from industry and business and the general public, and each one of these comments was addressed. When the final draft of the report was completed, it was distributed to over 46 governments. And those governments provided comments, which again, the reviewers addressed. The IPCC's sixth assessment report also had to deal with the pandemic. We started off by having in-person meetings. This is a photo of the author group from the 2018 meeting. Here's a photo from the 2019 meeting. And if you look really closely, you can see my face here about 3 rows back. But then we entered the pandemic, where we weren't able to have face-to-face meetings to discuss all the interactions there are in the climate sphere. We had to do this online, dealing with authors that have multiple different time zones. Now, I stated that there were over 230 authors, but when it comes down to providing the key recommendations of the IPCC, it's a relatively small author group. So regarding Chapter 9, it revolved around 21 people, for which I was very fortunate to be part of. So our author team, we reviewed the state of the climate regarding the oceans and the cryosphere, which means the ice on our planet, and used that to provide the projections of sea level that are oh so important for our understanding the impacts of climate changes on our infrastructure, on our economies, and our ecosystems. In Chapter 9, we provided a series of take-home points. And it's very pleasing when we look at these take-home points that some of them were based around data that has been collected by researchers here at the Earth Observatory of Singapore. This take-home point, stating that global mean sea level has risen faster since 1900 than any other preceding century in the past 3,000 years. This statement means that we're living in an unusual time, that the human attribution to sea level rise has meant that the changes in sea level are greater than any of the natural variability over at least the last 3,000 years. I have a graphic to illustrate this. This is taken from one of my graduate students' PhDs, where we looked at the rate of sea level change for the US Atlantic coast and divided that into century scale bins and looked at the processes that drive sea level. But the take-home point is that the rate in the 20th century of 3 millimeters per year is 2 or 3 times greater than any other century in the last 2,000 years. A second take-home point is firstly identifying what is the magnitude of change in the 20th and 21st century of around 0.2 meters from 1901 to 2018, but also that these rates are accelerating, changing from around 1.3 millimeters from 1901 to 1971 increasing to 3.7 millimeters from 2006 to 2018. This is a graphic from a paper which we published at the Earth Observatory of Singapore. We reviewed all the published literature that provided rates of global mean sea level change, be that derived from instrumental records from satellites or instrumental records from tide gauges. We subdivided the data into 20th century rates in red and 21st century rates in blue. And you can see, irrespective of the author, who uses different types of data sets, there's a significant increase between the rate in the 20th century and the rate in the 21st century. Now let's look at projections. The projections from the 6th assessment report need to be put into context compared with other landmark publications on projections of future sea level. So we have the 6th assessment report, AR6, is compared to SHROC, which was the IPCC's 2019 special publication on the state of the ocean and the cryosphere. It's compared with its predecessor, the AR5, the IPCC's 5th assessment report, and then a variety of landmark publications. And it's pleasing to see that one of those is a projection paper that we wrote at the Earth Observatory of Singapore, looking at sea level change for 2100 and 2300. It's important to compare the new projections of the 6th assessment with its predecessors because sea level change is a complex problem. Sea level rise in Singapore will be different than sea level rise in Manila or New York City or Oslo. And that's because we have a variety of driving processes, global, regional, and local, that will differ in space and in time. Here are the whole host of these processes, but I just want to highlight some of the major ones in the successive animations. So at the global scale, we have two problems to do with sea level rise. The bottom right shows the volume problem. If you increase atmospheric temperatures through our increases in greenhouse gases, that's transferred into the upper levels of our oceans. If you increase the heat of our oceans, you get thermal expansion. The ocean volume increases and sea level goes up. And this process has been responsible for approximately 40% of the sea level rise in the 20th century. On the top panel, we show a mass problem. Land-based ice on our planet, glaciers, ice caps, and ice sheets. If you increase atmospheric and ocean temperatures, they will melt. The water from the land-based ice is transferred into the ocean basins and sea level goes up. In the 20th century, glaciers contributed around 30% of global mean sea level rise. They were and continue to be very susceptible to changes in temperature. But in the 21st century, worryingly, it is our ice sheets that are contributing a significant amount, perhaps up to 40% of our current sea level rise. And why it is worrying is just because of the huge volume of water that these ice sheets contain. Greenland contains enough water to raise global sea levels by over 6 meters, but that's nothing compared to Antarctica. Antarctica is colossal. In size, it's 20,000 times the size of Singapore. It's 2 to 3 kilometers thick, and therefore it contains enough water within it to raise global sea levels by 65 meters. So you only need to melt a small percentage of that ice sheet to have devastating effects here in Singapore and elsewhere around the world. When we get down to regional factors, it becomes slightly more complex. On the top diagram is a process known as glacio-isostatic adjustment. This is a process that controls the spatial variability in sea level of the past, of the present, and a significant contributor to the future. And it's all related to extinct ice sheets. 20,000 years ago, the Earth was colder than today. And there were two large ice sheets, one over northwestern Europe called Fennoscandinavia, and one over North America called Laurentide. These were as big as the modern ice sheets in Antarctica. And therefore, underneath the solid Earth, they had significant pressure, which caused the Earth to subside. At the margins of the ice sheet, they uplifted. When those ice sheets melted, the land underneath the ice sheet uplifted and at the margins subsided. And these processes continue into the present day. On the bottom animation, we're talking about a process that changes the fingerprint of sea level rise around our planet because of a gravitational redistribution of water. So if we think about our present ice sheets, I've told you that Greenland and Antarctica are a colossal mass. Anything with a colossal mass has a strong gravitational attraction. So water is pulled towards these ice sheets. But as we go through the 21st century, Antarctica and Greenland are going to melt. They're going to lose their gravitational attraction. And hypothetically, the greatest sea level rise will be felt at regions distal from the ice sheet. So, for example, if Antarctica contributes 1 meter of sea level to our global oceans, the tropics, Singapore, for example, would receive 1.2 to 1.3 meters, 20 or 30% greater than the global average. Then we move to local processes. And the local processes are even more complex. And these are processes that are either poorly constrained or actually even unaccounted for in the IPCC's 6th assessment report. One of the poorly constrained processes is land subsidence due to groundwater withdrawal. So the increase in urbanization has meant that our cities require more and more fresh water, and they deplete our freshwater aquifers for agricultural, industrial, commercial, and residential use. You deplete the aquifers, the land subsides, you have a hotspot for sea level rise. Second, tectonics. Here in Southeast Asia, we have one of, if not the most actively tectonic region on our planet. And when an earthquake happens, we have significant land movement, both subsidence and uplift. Between earthquakes, we have more gradual land level movement of both subsidence and uplift. Currently, projections of sea level do not include this process. But if we want to accurately provide projections in Southeast Asia, this is something we must do. And finally, in Southeast Asia, an island archipelago, we have a very, very complex relationship between our atmospheres and our oceans. This is called ocean dynamics, and this is a process that can cause significant variability on sea level heights at decadal intervals. All of these processes are either poorly constrained or not accounted for, but all of these processes are being addressed as part of the National Sea Level Programme, which we have grants here at the Earth Observatory of Singapore. So now let's look at some projections. So we're going to look at projections on two shared socio-economic pathways. We'll look at the extremes. So we'll look at a low emission future, which is similar to the Paris Agreement shared socio-economic pathway, keeping our temperatures below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial averages. I will also look at SSP 5 8.5, which is the high emission future. This is the track of carbon dioxide emissions that we have been following for the past 40 or 50 years. First of all, let's look at the global mean sea level. So we look at projections of sea level beginning in 2020 out to 2100. We have sea level along the y-axis. In the blue is the low emission, in the red is the high emission. On the graphic is the 50th percentile or the median. In the table, we also show what the IPCC calls the likely range, going from the 17th to the 83rd percentile. So when we look at the median, we can see as we progress out through this century, we start to see a clear divergence between the low and the high emission, that by 2100, the low emission is around 40 centimeters and the high emission is around double of that at around 80 centimeters. When we look at the 83rd percentile, or the upper limit of the likely range, changes from around 50 centimeters to crossing over the 1 meter threshold at 1.01 meter. Now let's start to look at some local projections. So Singapore. Singapore's projections of the median is very, very similar to the global mean. 78 centimeters compared to the global mean of 77, 37 centimeters compared to the global mean of 38 centimeters. But when we start to look at the 83rd percentile, due to processes such as the gravitational relationship to the ice sheets, we now significantly cross that 1 meter threshold, now at around 1.2 meters. If Singapore is close to the global average, there are places on our planet that are significantly less and significantly more. In Oslo in Norway, the change in sea level for the 50th percentile is 40 centimeters compared to a global average of around 80 centimeters. And at the low emission, there is no net change. Why is that? Well, that is the process of glacial-isostatic adjustment. Oslo, 20,000 years ago, was beneath the Fenno-Scandinavian ice sheet, so therefore was subsided. When that ice sheet melted, the land uplifted, and the land uplift is keeping pace with sea level change. Conversely, New York City is greater than the global average, 1.04 compared to that 77 centimeters. The increase again is due to glacial-isostatic adjustment, or the vast majority is, because this region was uplifted 20,000 years or so because it was on the margins of the Laurentide ice sheet and has been subsiding. So we've got subsidence and a rising ocean level, meaning that New York City is a hotspot for sea level. But what is happening in Manila? Manila is thousands of kilometers away from the land level changes of Fenno-Scandinavia and the Laurentide, so it has minimal land level changes. The contribution here is subsidence from removal of groundwater. The expansion of the Manila urban area has meant that they're withdrawing year upon year more and more groundwater from their freshwater aquifer. The land is subsiding fast and sea level is rising. This is a problem for many Asian cities. And just look at the values, 1.3 meters, 50 centimeters higher than the 50th percentile of the globe. Just look at the low emission. Low emissions, we're talking about 93 centimeters or over 1 meter, even if we keep to the Paris Agreement. The other advancement of the IPCC is to look at processes for which we know the physics behind them. We know they've occurred in the geological past, but we have low confidence of whether they're going to occur in the 21st or 22nd century. But we need to start to modeling them because these are high impact, low likelihood events. And regarding sea level changes, it's results from the destabilization of Greenland and in particular Antarctica that significantly worry the scientific community. So there are two of these high impact, low likelihood processes that can influence our ice sheets. They're called marine ice shelf instability and marine ice cliff instability. On the marine ice shelf, our ice shelves buttress the land-based ice in Antarctica. It stops it contributing to the oceans. But these can collapse through increases in atmosphere and ocean temperatures. If they collapse, then Antarctica can significantly contribute to our oceans. And if that ice shelf is combined with an ice cliff, that the shelf comes back and then the ice sheet catastrophically contributes to the oceans, we've got significant problems to deal with. And we can model these. So these graphics look at the SSP high emission 5.8.5, and then these low confidence, these hill events, high impact, low likelihood. On the 50th percentile, we're going from 78 to 92 centimeters for Singapore. And our 83rd percentile stretches from 1.2 to 1.75. But these processes will have a significantly bigger impact in the 22nd century. So now we're going out to 2150. Now we get to big values where an existential threat to Singapore becomes an existential reality. Look at the 83rd percentile, over 5 meters. A third of Singapore exists only 2 to 3 meters above high tide. So sea level rise is an urgent problem, and the Earth Observatory of Singapore is putting time and effort and young minds through our PhD program to try and address this. We're trying to install new instrumental records to monitor the changes in the sea level. We're using geological data from corals and mangroves throughout the island to try and understand how does Singapore respond to sea level changes in the past, which then can calibrate our models to understand groundwater withdrawal, to understand tectonics, that can understand our ocean dynamics. So to conclude, the public, the government, businesses are all aware now of the threat of sea level rise. The IPCC provides values at low and high emission futures. The IPCC discusses instabilities with our ice sheets, which can cause catastrophic changes to low-lying regions. And here at the Earth Observatory of Singapore, we are trying to provide the data which can calibrate the models that can protect our infrastructure, our ecosystems, and society. Thank you.
Hello and welcome everyone. A very good afternoon if you're in Singapore or the region, and a very good day to you if you're elsewhere in the world. This is the discussion session for the webinar Preparing Singapore for Climate Change. And we are coming to you live from the National Supercomputing Center. So we have about half an hour for this Q&A discussion section of the webinar, and you've just heard 2 really fantastic presentations, and I'm sitting here live with Dr. Heiko Aydt, who presented on supercomputing for climate-informed urban planning, and Professor Ben Horton, whose presentation on sea level rise emergency you've just seen. So we have many questions coming in the chat box for the session, and perhaps we can kick off straight away. We have a question from Paul Charles Leopardi. Thank you, Paul. And I guess the question is for Heiko. He says, how do global and regional models provide boundary conditions for urban models? Perhaps Heiko, you could take this one.
Yeah, sure. So in the digital urban climate twin that I spoke about in the presentation, we have a number of models. And I mentioned urban climate models, and we actually use them on different scales, in particular on the mesoscale, on the microscale. So mesoscale is really covering the whole island. And the micro scale is when we are looking into the details of a neighborhood sized area, for instance. So what we are planning to do is, as part of this digital urban climate twin, we can run mesoscale simulations that cover the whole island, and then you basically take the part of that neighborhood that you're interested, and use that data as the boundary conditions for the micro simulation. And we're not really doing regional or global simulations as part of this work. Also, what we do have is the mesoscale is actually nested, so there's basically a regional model, and it gets nested to the fourth or fifth domain, which is basically Singapore.
Thanks for that, Heiko. Can you tell us a little bit about the resolution at the microscale that you can go down to? With the
well, the microscale, that really depends on what you're interested in this, but I would say, I think typically this is at a 1 meter resolution. But for the mesoscale, when we're covering the whole island, that's about 300 meters spatial resolution.
Yeah. Okay, and people are very interested in the concept of cooling Singapore and what can be done. We're now in the COP26 conference in the UK under the United Nations, and I read that if the world follows the current pledges that have been made for Glasgow, building upon the Paris Agreement, then we could be still looking at 2.7 degrees centigrade of warming by 2100. And how far do you think we can actually cool Singapore?
Yeah, so our work is mostly concerned with the urban heat island effect. But as I mentioned also during the presentation, there's basically two aspects to the urban heat challenge. There's of course climate change, so we're affected by that. And that's of course the big changes. And on top of that, we're adding the urban heat island effect, which is sort of it's a localized phenomenon. And of course, we get the peaks throughout a 24-hour period, and the peak is typically in the nighttime. But even during daytime, you observed higher temperatures in the city than in the surroundings. So if bad things come together, so generally the temperatures go up. On top of that, you may experience a heat wave, and then on top of that, you get the urban heat island effect, right? So that's obviously when all bad things come together. There's only so much that you can do, of course, with urban planning. You can add more shading, you can optimize wind flow. In particular in Singapore, wind flow is very important. In other countries, in tropical climate, water bodies don't work so well because the humidity is already so high, but in other places that works well as well. So there's a lot of things that you can do, but I mean, with climate change and global warming, at some point it's just getting warmer, and there's only so much that you can do.
And of course, warming has important implications for human health in terms of physiological stress. And you mentioned humidity there. So of course, in Singapore, we have a tropical climate. Humidity levels are high. And I've read about concern over wet bulb temperatures and high humidity. We are an island surrounded by the ocean. And do you have any comment on the possible risks of high humidity and wet bulb temperatures?
I mean, basically, if it's too warm, we sweat. But if the humidity is already very high, then there's only so much that sweating can help. And if you get both high temperatures and high humidity, then you're getting to a point where it actually becomes dangerous if you are exposed to this environment over an extended period of times. So if we get ever to that point, then the only thing that you can do is stay in an air-conditioned environment.
Okay.
So obviously that would be sort of, I guess, the worst-case scenario, that we at some point really confined to spending most of our time in air-conditioned environments.
And if we're using more air conditioning, that implies use of more energy as well. So how do we cope with the additional energy demand to cool Singapore?
Well, the energy demand is, of course, one thing, but I've briefly mentioned it as part of my talk as well. There's the anthropogenic heat emissions, which are contributing to the urban heat island effect. So the more air conditioning that we use, the more waste heat we're emitting into the city. So that's actually contributing to the problem.
It's like a positive feedback.
Yes. I mean, there's ways, for instance, you can work with district cooling.
Okay.
So that could be potentially a alternative compared to the split unit air conditioning that we currently have in residential areas. So there's ways, there's things that we can do about it. And the digital urban climate twin is really a tool that is meant for the policymakers and the planners to play through these kind of scenarios. Okay, what happens if we use district cooling in this particular, let's say in a typical HDB neighborhood of tomorrow, what if we use district cooling there? Does this, what happens? Would this be good? Would this give us what we want? So the digital urban climate twin is really meant to provide the capability for planners to evaluate these scenarios.
Thank you. Fantastic answer. I'm going to come back to you in a moment, okay, but perhaps move on to Professor Horton. Ben, in your presentation on sea level rise, you referred to emergency, and indeed the United Nations, the IPCC, now is telling us about the risk of what they call high impact, low likelihood events. And sea level rise has been referred to as an existential issue for Singapore. Could you just elaborate upon that for us? And what's the significance of the ice sheets, which are so far away anyway from Singapore?
Well, I think the existential threats on sea level, we could think about the existential threats of heating. I think it's very important that we realise how crucial it is to mitigate against our greenhouse gases, that people on this webinar do not think that we can cool Singapore. We have a program called Cooling Singapore. It does not mean that the temperatures in Singapore are going to be less at the end of this decade than they are now. They are going to be warmer. Adaptations only take you so far. So you're saying there's a limit to adaptation? If the ultimate adaptation is that we have to be inside between hours of 9 and 5 p.m., is that the type of life we want to live? I think in the pandemic, we've clearly seen the importance of nature. And sea level's exactly the same. Sea levels will go up. We've locked in processes that will cause them to rise. Yes. But what we have is an existential threat on sea level rise because of the ice sheets. So in my presentation, I talked about the variety of contributing factors, and that will cause sea level to increase globally, and areas will be greater or lesser than the mean. But as we move towards the latter part of this century, if we do not mitigate against greenhouse gases, then the rates of change are so fast that all the coastal ecosystems on our planet are gone. No mangroves, no oysters, no coral reefs.
And I believe hundreds of millions of people can be displaced because of this phenomenon.
Well, just think about that. I mean, so hundreds of millions of people, we can throw that number about, but you migrate a significant number of people. What does that cause? Economic, political instability. It causes wars. Indonesia has 16,000 islands. If we don't mitigate against greenhouse gases, they're going to be flooded and inundated. Where are those people going to go? Many of them will come to the shores of Singapore.
So one of the questions that we have here, Ben, is asking, can sea level rise be reversed?
No. It's about how fast and when. So there are two answers to this. One is that the greenhouse gases that we put in the atmosphere, they stay in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. So the climate change that we're experiencing now is the cumulative effect of all the greenhouse gases that have been burnt since the 1880s.
I believe that 50% of those greenhouse gases have been emitted since 1990.
Yes, because we've been accelerating. We're on this business as usual scenario. When I was presenting my answers, I talked about projections at SSP 5, 8.5. That's the business as usual. Regarding sea level, once you've increased our atmospheric temperatures, and they are going to increase, then you start the processes within the ice sheets and the oceans, and they have what is called a residence times. Our oceans are in the order of hundreds of years. Our ice sheets are in the order of 1,000 to 10,000 of years. So sea level is going to rise. So we know that
it's in the pipeline.
And we know the values about it. So for every degree centigrade that temperature rises, sea level goes up around 1.2 meters. So you mentioned that the IPCC COP agreements take it to around a 3-degree temperature rise. That means that if we do that, we've locked in over 3 meters of sea level rise minimum.
So is there any evidence in the Earth's climate history? I know that you're an expert on paleoclimate. can we look back in Earth's history at a time when we had this level of temperature around the Earth, or this level of CO2, and make deductions about where we're headed?
Well, I think observations and reconstructions of climate are crucial. It's the only way that we can understand how the Earth works. We do a variety of sensitivity studies with models, but you need the data to calibrate it. So the climate community has been reconstructing past climates. And we know that there was a period in the Earth's history around 3 million years or so ago known as the Pliocene.
Yeah.
And in the Pliocene, carbon dioxide levels were just slightly higher than today's.
About
we're running
415 we're at today.
We're
right?
at 450. It's about 460 parts per million by volume. The sort of CO2 levels that we'll reach in the next
And
few
I believe
decades.
the current level is now 50% higher than it was prior to industrial activity.
Yes, yes. Well, you know, the Earth's
we're
climate,
well on the way.
The Earth's climate over the last 800,000 years has fluctuated on CO2 levels between around 180 and 280. But going back to your question, you can go back to the Pliocene. You've got CO2 levels which we will reach in the next few decades, and you can say, okay, what was the climate? So the climate was around 3 degrees C warmer than today. Oh, that's what you mentioned previously to do with COP. And then what was the sea levels? So we can go around and you can find raised coral reefs or raised shorelines, and they're 10 to 20 meters higher than today.
10 to 20 meters?
10 to 20 meters.
Okay.
And that is where you get into this aspect that an existential threat that the Prime Minister mentions in the National Day rally becomes an existential reality for island nations such as Singapore. 10 to 20, and that has happened in the past. You provide the same forcing, it will happen. So that's why mitigation against temperatures and humidity in Singapore, mitigation about ice sheets that are 10,000 kilometers away from Singapore is so crucial.
So can we expect sea level to change in a slow, predictable, linear way going forward?
Well, that's a really difficult question, is to know when we will get these thresholds crossed, where you get tipping points and you go from gradual rises to exponential or instantaneous rises in sea level.
There's a level of unpredictability in this.
We know this, again, you go back to the geological past, you can go back to a period 14,000 years or so ago. Temperatures were cooler than today, and we had 2 large ice sheets existing on our planet, one in North America and one in northwestern Europe, and they didn't melt gradually. They had these things called meltwater pulses. And in a period of around 500 years, sea level went up around 40 meters at rates of 30 millimeters per year.
Fairly rapid collapse.
And they completely changed the geography that we live on today. 14,000 years or so, we could walk out of this, our offices here, and you could walk across to Peninsular Malaysia, Sumatra, across land bridges to the Philippines. And it's quite incredible. And then they were broken. I mean, the thing about it is that from the past, we can understand how the Earth works. And I say this phrase quite a lot to people. I mean, I've been studying climate change and paleoclimate change for my whole career. And if the people on the webinar knew what I knew about how the Earth reacts to forcing, you'd be very, very scared. I mean, it is very worrying what the Earth is capable of. And so COP26 is crucial. What they're dealing with today is going to affect. The thing about climate change that's really worrying is things are happening far more rapidly than we thought they would do. We were always thinking about climate change, it's what happens in 2100. No, it's going to happen potentially in our lifetime, certainly our children's
lifetime. The statement
lifetime.
is widespread, rapid, and intensifying. I think Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has called climate change code red for humanity. And Boris Johnson, who opened the COP26 conference on Sunday, just gone, said at 1 minute to midnight regarding the need for climate action. But I'm going to come back to you on that, Ben. I'm going to take another question. And this one is from Joshua. Thank you, Joshua. And I think it's directed to Heiko. He's basically asking, Heiko, are supercomputers actually needed? Strange question, sitting in the National Supercomputing Centre. But he said, can this type of work be done through parallel programming of network nodes of dispersed servers. And we've also had questions in relation as to whether this work can be based on the web, on the cloud. Is that possible?
Yes, absolutely. Let me perhaps elaborate a bit.
Thank you.
So this digital urban climate twin isn't based on one single model. It's a federation of models. Some of these models actually can even run on your laptop. They're not particularly compute intensive. Whereas then we have other models, especially the urban climate models. They are very compute intensive, and they tend to require quite a bit of computing resources. And that's why we work with the NSCC, for instance, so that we can run them in a supercomputing environment. However, we also make use of cloud computing environments, so things can also run in the cloud. What is a supercomputer? A supercomputer is basically lots of clusters with lots of computers, in a sense, networked together with a very high-speed, network. So there's nothing that stops us from running the models in the cloud as well, which we do. So the federation of models is really an inherently distributed system. So different components run on different nodes, if you like, in the network. So yeah, I think, yeah, we can definitely use supercomputers, but we don't have to. We are also working on so-called surrogate models. You can, I mentioned scenarios, right? And let's say you end up with 100 scenarios that you want to simulate. Not all of these are from the onset very promising. So you don't want to, throw your higher performance computing, which by the way is also not exactly cheap. Right. You don't want to throw it at scenarios where, well, they're maybe not so good. Right. So you use surrogate models and, do a short listing.
Oh, and we hear about supercomputers and data centers using too much power and electricity and actually contributing to climate change. What do you think about that? Should these models be run on renewable, carbon neutral energy sources?
Well, ideally, I think everything should run on renewables. But it's true. The irony is that we use supercomputers, which you need quite a bit of cooling for these supercomputers, which again, of course, contributes to the localized urban heat island effect. Okay. So we want to make use of supercomputers in a smart way and not just like simulate everything with a supercomputer just because we can, but we want to be selective about it. It's also a matter of time. I mean, you have supercomputers, but I mentioned this during the presentation. There's limits to scalability. Just because you have the most powerful computer in the world doesn't mean that your model, this one particular simulation runs 1,000 times faster. So running models can take days and in the worst case, weeks. So you really want to be selective about it and maybe use the surrogate models that I mentioned earlier to do a short listing of the scenarios before you throw your, your high performance computing models at it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we have a question. Basically, somebody's asking, I live in an HDB and it's getting warmer and I'm feeling more uncomfortable. How can Cooling Singapore help me? What can actually be done at that scale, for example, in an HDB precinct? Yes.
So there's only so much that we can do, of course, with retrofitting. I think more interesting are newer projects where there's a lot more freedom of what you can do. And as part of the Cooling Singapore project, we do work with a series of the government agencies, including HDB and also URA, amongst others. And of course, what we can also do is, with our tools, contribute to allowing them to evaluate different kind of scenarios, and then for newer developments, perhaps make different design choices. I mentioned earlier things like district cooling. I believe there are some studies underway to evaluate whether that makes any sense.
Can you explain to us what district cooling actually is?
Right. So at the moment, what we have is, with the residential units, I think everyone knows, you have your split unit, your neighbor has it, and pretty much everyone in your building has their own split unit, air conditioning unit. And the issue with those is that they emit waste heat, partially because of the inefficiency of the air conditioning system themselves, but also there's, of course, the heat that it transports from the inside to the outside. Everyone does this in your block, and of course, heat goes up, and then the surrounding temperatures around your air conditioning, the split units outside, is higher, which is bad for the efficiency of the...
Particularly if you live higher in the building, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I use a ceiling fan myself,
Yeah, that's perhaps a better choice. So the other option is if we had district cooling, you can basically, you still have to emit the heat somewhere. You have to release it into the environment, right? But if you have district cooling, you can choose a strategic location where you want to emit that heat. And you can do this in a place perhaps where it doesn't bother people so much. So you will still produce that waste heat. There may be some more efficiency in the system overall, but it's more the choice of where you're emitting this heat into the environment. And you can do so in a place where perhaps it doesn't people...
Thank you for that. I'm going to come back to you again in a minute on this topic, but maybe back to Ben in the meantime. We're getting questions specifically in relation to Singapore and sea level rise. We all know that we live on an island surrounded by the sea, and it's a fairly low-lying island. And basically, what are the causes and impacts associated with a rising sea on Singapore, and what can we do to adapt to that situation?
Well, that's rather a large question, and I think I could sit here and talk about it for hours.
As we often do together,
because
yeah.
This is really...
In a nutshell.
This is the crux of the matter. So to do with sea level rise, just like anything, so again, if we turn to urban heat island effects, you have to understand the processes that drive it. So with sea level rise, as I explained in my presentation, you've got to understand the big global drivers to do with thermal expansion of our oceans and the melting of land-based ice, and they will influence every location around the planet. Then you'll have big regional influences. Regional influences such as glacial-isostatic adjustment, which influences the land, particularly in the northern hemisphere. For the tropics, we need to understand the gravitational fingerprint of melting our contemporary ice, where there'll be more water along the poles. So we need to run a variety of models that look at the simulation.
They're thousands of kilometers away. Why should we be bothered?
Well, because these ice sheets, Antarctica, it's 20,000 times the size of Singapore. It's 2 to 3 kilometers thick. It's got a massive gravitational attraction. So the water is attracted towards the poles. You lose that mass, the attraction weakens, the water migrates towards the tropics. So we have to understand that and have a variety of simulations of how those ice sheets will change through time. And then we get down to the local scale factors. Currently, those local scale factors are either rather unconstrained or even not included in climate projections. And that's where an aspect such as the National Sea Level Programme comes in, where funding from the Singaporean government goes to the institutes of higher learning to understand the local scale factors, which are important for Singapore, but wouldn't be important for other locations. So understanding the influence of ocean dynamics around here. We have a very, very complicated bathymetry and island archipelago, and we have to understand which areas of Singapore will have higher or lower sea levels because of that. We need to understand subsidence. So are there areas that are subsiding or uplifting? We have to understand the influence of tectonics. Singapore may not be actively tectonic, but we've got lots of tectonic plates around us. And when an earthquake happens, not only does it influence the epicenter, it influences the whole of the region. So we need to do a variety of simulations of what happens at areas of the Sunda Trench that ruptured in 2004. Now, where does it happen? So they're all the processes. Then you have to understand, okay, what are the impacts? And sea level rise, even in the smallest amount, has impacts on drinking water because it contaminates the fresh water, has impact on food, not the food grown here in Singapore, but we import over 90% of our food. So what does it have effect on where our food
security,
food security and supply chain? So there's going to be huge impacts on the rice fields in Vietnam, low-lying areas, so influences our food security. Then we have influences on storms. Storms have a baseline, and their baseline is sea level, so it changes the frequency of storms.
So these are a couple processes going on between the ocean and the atmosphere. Ben, you're the director of the Earth Observatory Singapore, and what observations would you recommend that Singapore adopts in order to understand the climate system better?
Well, I think it's the collection of data is key. We need to have a holistic approach where all agencies within Singapore, the data they collect are made freely available for people from the Supercomputing Centre, from yourself at CCRS and ourselves at EOS, so we can understand those processes I spoke about. So if we want to have a look at ocean dynamics, we need to have the data from the oceans. Okay. We need to identify what data is currently collected and be allowed access to it, identify data gaps, and go out there and collect it ourselves.
Get that observational data to support the modelling.
It is. We can't just think that just doing models is going to be the answer. You've got to calibrate it. Right. You've got to realise what are
real-world data.
What are the processes that the model aren't including, but are significant to understand the impacts here in Singapore. Yeah. We see here in Singapore now that we have very, very high rainfall downpours. This is to be expected. You put more water vapour in the atmosphere, if increased temperature, it's going to come down, and it's going to come down fast.
Yeah, heavier, more frequent.
Heavier,
intense.
more frequent. But one of the problems we have is that our infrastructure commonly thought that we could collect this drinking water and pump it out into the oceans. But if we get higher sea levels on top of a higher tide, on top of a storm, that water will have nowhere to go. So that's where observations and modelling, think
very
of it
important.
holistically.
So as you know, CCRS, my centre, is doing the study for Singapore to downscale global observations, global modelling relevant to Singapore as a nation. Very important that all these elements come together. Observations, modelling, supercomputing.
Crucial.
Okay. We have more questions coming in. Ronald Chan is saying that the Singapore government is taking a wait-and-see approach because the highest sea level predictions are high impact but low probability. How do we make the economic cost of sea level rise tangible for policymakers?
That's a great question. I mean, the aspect there is that what I would say to Ronald is that the science has progressed dramatically over the last 5 or 6 years. If we take ourselves back to the 5th assessment report of the IPCC in 2013, when we produced that report, there were no regional projections. It was just the global mean.
Now AR6 has those.
Now you can, so in my presentation, we can now give you a projection for Singapore, or if you were interested in Oslo, New York, Manila, Jakarta, wherever you are, we now have those regional projections with uncertainties. The next aspect is we also, for the first time, look at these high impact, low likelihood events. The question now is, how do policymakers use those?
How do they make decisions based upon the science?
Yes, and this is where I think there needs to be a much stronger partnership between policymakers and the scientists, because policymakers can't be expected to understand the details of the science.
And maybe we can bring Heiko in at this point. What is the role of climate science education in Singapore, both within primary, secondary schools and in institutes of higher learning as well? How can Singapore develop its climate science curriculum, do you think?
I think this is a good point. We have done some outreach, actually, as part of previous Cooling Singapore projects with workshops. Citizen engagement is a key word here. But I think this really has to start already in primary school. So that people really get this understanding of climate change. I think one thing that humans are absolutely terrible is with exponential functions, for instance, but also long time scales. I mean, you mentioned this earlier, right? We thought, well, this happens in 2100, that's after my lifetime, but actually things are happening today. So trying to get this into people's heads, to put it simply, I think you can't start early enough.
Okay, that's great. And we have a specific question for you, Heiko, from Kian Kwatsun. He's basically asking, where do the digital twin 3D models come from? And can you explain a little bit more about the models? So it's pretty fundamental.
Well, it's what I said during the presentation as well. So it's not just a 3D model for the purposes of visualization. We have that as well. We have a number of models. They use a variety of data. The issue that we have, I guess, is that we need a variety of data that comes from multiple sources. So you have to negotiate with each or party that owns the data to use it. which takes time, which isn't always easy. And then, of course, you merge these, you fuse these, and then there's a lot of questions also about what you can use the data for. So that's obviously not so easy. I'm actually in a slightly better position than my colleagues, because my colleagues are actually the ones who run the simulations, and they want to produce reliable results. So they really have to use data that is good and credible and reliable. In my case, I'm building the system, so I can potentially get away with using public data. OpenStreetMap, for instance, is publicly available. It isn't the greatest data source, but it can help me to build the system. And once it's built, then of course the agencies at some point, that would be division, they would be able to upload their data, which is much better quality, and then can run the simulations on their own.
Shojana is asking the question on everybody's lips, I guess, which is how much will the outdoor temperature drop after district cooling? What are the limits? You've touched upon this before. And perhaps we can also ask, are there any other examples from around the world where urban cooling has been achieved, at least to some extent?
Yes, I think it really matters on the context. So for instance, from colleagues, we heard that in Australia, for instance, because they have a different climate, water bodies helps for cooling through evaporation. This doesn't work so well in Singapore because the humidity is already high, so you have to take into consideration the context. In Singapore, shading is a big issue. So you want to have shading. You want to work with airflow. You want to make sure that wind flow is not obstructed. Wind speeds are generally low in Singapore. You don't want to even obstruct this any further. So really you have to work with what you have. The other thing is that you need to realize is that sometimes this idea of, okay, what do we have to do in order to get the average temperature lower by so and so many degrees? But actually that's not very meaningful. Because what you want to look at is where are the people and where does it matter? So for instance, the example of the district cooling is that I mentioned earlier is you want to place the heat emission where it doesn't bother anybody, right? So it isn't so much about what is the average temperature up and down, because it's very spatially and temporally, there's a variety there. So you want to make sure that what you're ultimately interested in is the autothermal comfort. You want to make sure that where people are, this is where you optimize climatic conditions.
So we're getting to the end of the session now, and I'm going to try and summarize a few questions and encapsulate them here. But basically, one of the central objectives of the current conference, COP26, is keeping the Paris temperature target of 1.5 degrees centigrade of average global warming alive. And currently the globe is between 1.1, 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming. And people are asking, what about mitigation? Can Singapore capture carbon and somehow utilize carbon to bring down temperatures? A little bit different from your presentations, but do you have any opinion on this, Ben?
Well, I mean, as we go through into the 21st century, you would hope that there are technologies that can use carbon and capture and storage at a grander scale than the current sort of startups that we have now. Yeah. So I like the idea of carbon capture and storage because it uses sort of nature-based technologies. It understands how the Earth works in the fact that you can take carbon dioxide as a gas, you can compress it into a liquid, and then you can store it underground. Ironically, the best place to store it is where the oil or the petroleum came from, because that was stored underground by an impenetrable substrate. So that is the theory behind it, but at the moment it's very, very high cost and at a very small scale. But we do have other analogies that can say, well, this is a really good, that costs will come down. If we just think of the price of voltaics, solar voltaics have gone down 90%, wind's gone down 80%.
Lithium batteries too, yeah.
The expansion of lithium batteries, how much energy they can store. So we have all these things that technology will give us an answer. I see a question here about, is COP26 too little, too late? No, but it is very close to being. They're going to come to a point where we're going to say, yeah, we've missed the window of this.
And I think, another central objective of the conference is achieving the $100 billion a year investment into climate mitigation adaptation, particularly for developing countries. And this represents a huge economic opportunity, an opportunity to develop the circular and green economy. And of course, Singapore is well placed to do that. Heiko, do you have any thoughts about this in terms of green technology development and opportunity?
Yes, I think generally, I think that is also related to your earlier question. I think Singapore can take Singapore is recognized as a very well-managed city. And if they can basically also help other cities within the region, Southeast Asia, also beyond that, how to do things, how to manage their city better, how to mitigate certain effects of the urban heat challenge. I think that's a way how Singapore can help beyond its own efforts to mitigate heat. And of course, technology is always. I'm very, I'm all into technology. So if there's something where entrepreneurs can come in and build new technologies to basically capture CO2, that would be great. And if that can start in Singapore and then you export this beyond,
fantastic.
That would be
In
fantastic.
fact, the International Energy Agency has estimated that the technology green economy could be worth $100 trillion by the middle of the century. That's the scale of the opportunity that we're talking about. So obviously in terms of research and development, technology development, everything that Singapore does so well, then great opportunity. So I think we're drawing to the end of the discussion session now.
Can I
quick
just
comment from
say
Ben?
something?
Please do.
This aspect about the middle of the century is slightly meaningless to me. I mean, I can stand up here and say, oh, my family and my house is going to be carbon neutral by 2050. Anyone can say that. What I'm more interested in COP26 is what happens by 2030, because we have to peak our emissions then, to then move back. And we have to, what are the
actually,
technologies?
the United Nations is saying that we have to halve our emissions by 2030 and then get to net zero by 2050.
So what are the mechanisms to do that? Because they're actionable. They're the ones that you can put people to task on. So just to finish off, at NTU, we previously had an aspect where we would go carbon neutral sometime in the 21st century. But our
as late
president...
as 2099.
Our
That's
president was more ambitious and said, no, we're going to do this by 2035. And they're the type of ambitions that companies, countries, individuals, communities must have.
And not forgetting the younger generation as well, so empowering them to do something. And indeed, it's all about ambition and action at COP26. So with that, thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, Heiko. Fantastic presentations. Thanks to all of you for your amazing, great questions. Sorry we couldn't answer them all, simply ran out of time, but I will continue to discuss with Ben and Heiko after the session. At this point, I'm going to hand back to Alethea to close the session. Over to you, Alethea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Aydt, Prof. Horton, and Prof. Aydt for the great and insightful sharing, and thank you to everyone for the ongoing questions. The recording of this session will be uploaded on NSCC's YouTube channel, so do head there for a review of today's event. Do also take a few minutes to complete the survey form, which can be accessed at this QR code or will pop up when you exit, and provide us with any feedback and suggestions that you may have that could help us to improve our future webinars. Lastly, the annual Supercomputing Asia Conference will be back as a hybrid event next year from the 1st to the 3rd of March. Do head over to www.sc-asia.org for more details on the event and keep your eyes peeled for more updates coming soon. Thank you once again to our speakers and moderator, and thank you everyone for your time. See you at our next online event.